Hello, so my name's Leigh Anne Galloway, and I'm here to talk to you about how I bought an ATM. And I realise that I'm now the single thing that stands between you and lunch, so I apologise about that. Feel free to leave if you have any questions and we don't get round to them during the presentation. Then I've got my email address at the end of the presentation, so feel free to email me directly, or you can send me a message on Twitter, that's fine as well. So I have quite a lot of content. We'll see how we get on. So this is the introduction into how I bought an ATM. So back in sort of September, October of 2016, a PR guy at the company I work at, which is Positive Technologies, had the bright idea that for a conference, so InfoSec 2017, he said, you know, guys, I think it's a really great idea if we try and buy an ATM. It'll be fantastic for the stand, it'll draw in a crowd. But I've read online that researchers have been able to buy components from eBay and reconstruct a working ATM. Do you think this is possible? So a few of my colleagues looked into this, and the idea looked very complicated and it wasn't very easy to go about, so they dropped this as an idea. And as it turns out, you can still buy parts of an ATM on eBay today. So in March 2017, I joined the company, and this idea was mentioned, and people had said, oh, it was very complicated, impossible, you can't just buy an ATM unless you're a bank, or you do it illegally. So I said, you know what, I'll have a go, which started the journey into buying an ATM. So just to be clear, so I come from a background of primarily doing incident response, payment card data breach investigations, so I have quite a lot of experience working for financial institutions, looking at card data itself, but I've never worked with ATMs prior to this. My only experience of using an ATM was, frankly, withdrawing cash. So in order to get started with this, I just want to talk briefly about the history of ATMs. And as the story goes, a chap called John Shepherd Barron, he drove to his local branch of a bank on a Saturday afternoon, and he tried to withdraw cash. Unfortunately, this wasn't possible, and he decided this was absolutely absurd. So John happened to be an inventor, so he came up with an idea of how you could dispense money from a machine and do this in a semi-automated way. He approached a bank called Barclays, which is a UK bank, and said, I have this good idea. So they worked for about a year on this prototype, and in 1967, in Enfield in London, the first cash dispenser was installed in the UK. And in the same year, a further 2 machines were installed globally. So there was one in Sweden by the National Bank and another by the Bank of Westminster. And at this point, primarily the prototypes for cash dispensers were being developed individually by different companies. No brands existed at this point. And it took a further 2 years for the US to have their own cash dispensers. But shortly after that, so in the 60s and 70s, we see a lot of development, and the marketplace grows quite quickly. So in 1972, the first online ATM was installed by Lloyds, which is a British bank. And now in 2017, we have about 3.8 million units in circulation worldwide. And a little further information, so if you're going to buy an ATM, then you need to know what kind of manufacturers we have in the marketplace. So predominantly, most of us might be familiar with NCR and Wincor. They're very popular in North America and Europe, but there's some other manufacturers as well in Asia. So I'm going to talk about the market options I looked at when it came to buying an ATM. So there were 4 ways for me. There was the legal option, so that's looking at manufacturers, banks, and ATM maintainers. And then there's the grey market option, so that's where things seem reasonably legal, but you're not 100% sure of the background of where this thing came from. The black market option, which I did frankly look at briefly, which I think we all know is something where it's quite dubious, the background of those kind of items. And then the last option, which I'll go into, is the wildcard option, which I considered, which involved the road trip of a lifetime and possible imprisonment. So let's get started. So talking about grey market options, so I talked a little bit about eBay, and it's really easy for you to have a look and see what's available online yourself. When I was looking, a lot of the units that were available were in other countries, so shipping to the UK just meant that the cost of the unit was just well out of proportion for buying. It was upwards of 10,000 euros. And just to give you an idea of price, so if you buy a brand new ATM, you're looking at sort of 20,000, 30,000 upwards. But I was looking at used units predominantly. So as it turned out, so I was having a look at eBay for a few weeks in March and April, and this came up, which seemed to fit the bill. So there's a couple of reasons why. So it looks like it was working. They included a VAT receipt, which was very handy. It was about £1,000, which isn't relatively that much money. There were only a few issues with this. So first of all, I needed to work out if this machine was actually working, so I'd need to go and see it in person. And the second issue with this is it had no keys. But no problem, I have friends working in security, all of which were willing to help me with lockpicking and or brute forcing my way into the vault. So that was no issue whatsoever. So it looked like I had the answer to buying an ATM at this point. So I felt relatively confident. I did some research online to determine who was selling this, and it turns out the company is a company that deals with a lot of medical used goods. I found a contact number for them, and I phoned them up. They then told me that they had the unit. I could see it, no problem. It was Friday when I phoned them up, but they said, unfortunately, we're quite busy at the moment. We can't take receipt of you at the warehouse to come and have a look at this unit. We'll keep it for you and phone you on Monday to come and have a look. Monday rolls round, and unfortunately, they were very quiet, and I became a bit nervous. So I had a look at their eBay listing, and as you can see, unfortunately, the item had been unlisted. It sounds quite dubious at this point, so I was a bit upset. Tried to get hold of the company, and they didn't want to take my call. So ensued a rather interesting email conversation, whereby they said, I'm afraid this ATM has been sold via a website. For me, that was quite hard to believe because their website looked like it had been constructed in the 90s. Followed by my counter-offer, to which they told me to go away. So after this, I was really rather sad and still needed an ATM for InfoSec, which is in June. So I had to consider some other options. So my black market options basically consisted of messaging and phoning a lot of friends that I have and asking if they knew of any ways in which I could obtain an ATM very, very quickly, no matter the method. This didn't go too far, but you may know dodgier friends, so this is an option to consider when you're looking at buying an ATM. And the fourth option is, yes, my CEO endorses the craziest of ideas. So this involved a road trip of over 1,800 miles all the way from Russia to the UK with a guaranteed ATM, but unfortunately might mean that I would have to spend some time in prison. Because if you want to cross the border from Russia into the rest of Europe, customs require you to have a deposit that's worth well over the cost of the actual goods, unfortunately. And with my nationality being British as well, there was some question over whether this was a good idea. But I was ensured that we could get an ATM in this way, and it would only take about a week of continuous driving. Sounds like a great idea, right? So let's talk about the legal procurement method, which is what I ended up going with. This is definitely the easiest option. It may be even easier for some of you depending where you live. So what I did is I have some friends in banks, and I said, can you lend me an ATM? You have ATMs in your security labs. Is that a possibility? Some of my friends were happy enough to entertain the idea, and they they asked if this was a possibility but were unable to. I also spoke to some of my friends who have contacts at manufacturers like NCR, but they weren't particularly interested in giving a security company an ATM for a while. And then the last thing I looked at, which is the way in which I obtained an ATM, is ATM maintainers. So there's companies like SPC International and Testlink, which supply the whole of Europe. So again, you might know people in banks who are willing to lend you an ATM. That might be an easier option for you, but I actually went about buying an ATM permanently. And so what these companies do is, so they maintain for NCR and Wincor, and for many of the banks, they do the maintenance. They'll do refurbishment on all the components, and they can also sell used units in varying conditions. So let's talk about what you need to know in order to buy an ATM. So you need to factor in the kind of models that you might consider. I would suggest going for a freestanding model because it's much easier to move around. You have to factor in that, especially in the UK, from my experience, is that you have to have a good backstory. So it's not the most complicated of social engineering, but when I spoke to these companies, they had said things like, I've worked here for 5 years as an account manager, and this is the first time I've had this kind of an inquiry, because they're used to selling multiple units to financial institutions. So if you want to buy just one ATM, you have to have a bit of a story that checks out. When I chose to just stand by the story that I work for a security company, we do ATM assessments, we have ATMs in other countries, all of which is true. You have to factor in lead time. So if you look at ATM maintainers, they know that they're going to get in certain models of ATMs within the next 6 months, but if you have a specific deadline like I had, which was a conference, you have to take that into consideration. So they might have specific units or specific components that you're interested in, but you just need to factor in that the lead time tends to be quite long, as well as the potential delivery time. You also need to know the exact configuration, so I alluded to that with the models, so you need to know what kind of PC you want in there, whether you want an international PIN pad, and as I said, whether you want freestanding or built into a wall. And then in terms of logistics, this is probably the hardest bit. It's relatively easy to buy an ATM. Storing, moving, and supplying power to an ATM is probably the hardest part in my experience. So ATMs tend to weigh close to a ton in weight, which means that no floor is suitable for this thing. Absolutely no floor. And of course, some of the security is built into the vault, weighing a lot. It's just something that you need to consider. So eventually I was able to buy an ATM via Testlink, as you can see, for the grand total of about £3,200, including VAT, which, relatively speaking, is not that much money for a working ATM. And one thing I've missed out. So you need to understand the differences between a tested machine and a refurbished machine. So if you speak to a maintainer, a tested machine means that they think that most of the components work, but there's no assurance. If you buy a refurbished machine, they refurbished every single component. So this is really critical when you're buying an ATM. So as I said, I bought an ATM. It all seemed good, great. I was very happy, but I learned a few other things along the way. So as I alluded to, so logistics are a complete nightmare. So let's talk about some logistical issues. So this was roughly my expectations for delivery day. And this was what happened instead. So as I mentioned, no floor is suitable for an ATM. So this ATM arrived on the back of a small truck with a powered tail lift. And the guy who delivered the ATM clearly knew what he was doing, but it was clearly overweighted for the van. And he said, sorry, I can't take this into the ground floor of a building. It'll just destroy the floor. So I had an ATM delivered into a car park, which wasn't great because in the UK it rains a lot for a start. And it has a computer inside of it which doesn't love rain. So then there was another issue. So I'll try and play this. So The weekend before InfoSec, I had to supply power to this ATM, which involved lowering an extension cord. I did buy an outdoor extension cord, I will point out, down from the top of a three-story building.
Where you are is great.
So I had to deal with all manner of things with this ATM. Another thing to point out that I discovered is details really matter when it comes to purchasing an ATM. I failed to realize that we hadn't purchased a cassette. Now, the cassettes go inside the dispenser and they hold money. And as part of buying an ATM, it was to demonstrate how to cash out money from an ATM with custom notes. So we needed access to a cassette. So as I said, details matter, so make sure you check all the information. So let's talk about how it works and how you can break it, the security stuff. All right, so as I talked about a little about, it has a PC at the top, it has a pin pad and a card reader, and then at the bottom you've got the dispenser, which you can see is pulled out to the right-hand side, and that sits within the vault. And a lot of security is in the physical weight of the vault, which we'll talk about later. And all of this will connect to the bank's network. And it looks roughly like this. So you could have an ATM, the bottom, which sits within a branch, so it connects directly into the ATM network, or you could have a lease line or a 3G or 4G modem. So let's talk a bit about the kind of attacks that you can see. So brute force, still the most popular, unbelievably, to ATMs. And then we've got OS level attacks, hardware attacks, and network attacks. And what you'll find in most cases is many attack vectors involve a combination of all of these. So if we look at the history of attacks, most people are probably familiar with Barnaby Jack. He demonstrated a way to cash out from ATMs at Black Hat in 2010. And he used that by connecting to remote admin tools on the ATMs. And then in 2012, we saw the first emergence of black box attacks, followed closely by logical attacks, and then PT, along with a number of other companies, published research on the security of ATMs in 2014. So brute force, still very popular. 2016 saw a rise of 30%, but it has its downsides. Obviously, you have a high risk of being caught. Another really interesting factor about brute force is that we've even seen examples of where attackers have basically pulled out ATMs from walls using a car, but then they haven't factored in how to actually lift an ATM and put it onto a truck. As I said, ATMs weigh a lot, so you have to really think about the logistics of these things. It's very difficult to lift something that weighs 800 kilos onto a van and then escape very quickly, because it's also a tip hazard in the van. And just to show you what some of that looks like, so here's some examples even in the UK. So a lot of people think that brute force attacks happen in only specific kind of countries, but they happen everywhere in Europe. This was a case in 2016 in Leeds. Here's another case in the UK, and that's basically what it looks like if you use the most popular method. So the most popular method is to take a crowbar. I'm not advocating that you do this. Take a crowbar and leverage open the front of the dispenser, so where the money comes out, and then you insert compressed gas and ignite it, and it blows the back of the door off, and most of the money will be intact. Again, not advocating that you do that. So let's talk about operating system level attacks. So the first mechanism that you'll see is not really a security mechanism, but it's something called kiosk mode. You see this on terminals as well. Kiosk mode basically just presents the user with a limited number of functions, but it's kind of an overlay, so it's just an application that sits on top. So as demonstrated, I have cats in my presentation as well. So as demonstrated by my cats, Annabelle and Elliot, using a number of hotkeys, you can bypass this window and gain access to the operating system. You also have things like the mouse icon is disabled, but that's okay, because again, you can just use your keys to access the file system. It's no issue at all. So just a quick video of what that looks like. And I apologize in advance because there's a screen refresh rate that doesn't match up with my video. This is the normal screen or a screen you would see on an ATM. All I need to do is, utilizing some keys on the keyboard, is I can use some key combinations to gain access to the operating system. And then some money comes out. Okay, and just to cover a few other things, because there's so many things to talk about on this specific topic, we also have things like malware, which obviously operate at the same level. That generally interacts with XFS, which has an open API. What else do we have? So we have application control, which is a form of software which tends to sit on ATMs, which whitelists certain programs, but the problem with that, it's relatively easy to bypass, is that many of the programs that it whitelists, you can run third-party executables in many of those programs, and many of the pieces of software available to do this have vulnerabilities associated with them. Okay, hardware. So another interesting fact about ATMs is, whilst most of the ATM is made of metal, the front of it tends to be plastic. So in some cases, it's so flimsy that you can break it with your hands, or you can use a household drill. So I use my own drill to do this. And as you can see, it's just plastic, so you can cut bits of the ATM out. Some people might say this is unrealistic, but we've seen evidence that the whole facade of ATMs have been replaced by attackers before, so it happens quite frequently. So then you can gain access to all aspects of the computer. All right, so some other examples. So here we've got Arduino and Teensy. So you can do things like use an embedded system to basically connect directly to some aspect of either the computer or the dispenser in this case, and send commands directly. This is reliant on you getting access to the service area at the back. If you find an ATM that's just a standalone ATM, this is quite possible. Or you could do things like bribe a service engineer. I don't think it costs that much. And then you can also potentially connect directly into the ATM network, because in some cases, all of the equipment is not physically protected in any way. And there are other options. So if you wanted to if you were able to gain access to the network, you could push malware, or you can access other ATMs by using things like OS service updates or compromising VPN credentials. So there's a lot of options. Many of the attacks involve multiple vectors, and it's a very interesting area, but we have to move on. So let's talk about money. So in a typical ATM, you have 4 cassettes of different denominations. So in this example, I've got some fake notes. But the value within an ATM depends on factors like when it was last replenished, how many of the cassettes are in service, and whether all of the notes are new. So if you have fresh notes in an ATM, each cassette holds about 2,000 notes. If you have a range of mixed notes, then it's about 1,800. And that's quite important because in the UK, we've recently been issued with polymer notes. So actually, you do find that many ATMs have a lot of freshly printed notes. So you can have more money. So anyone have a guess as to how much in euros you might find in an ATM? Higher. Lower. It's around 120,000 euros, give or take, depending on those other factors. So if you're an attacker, I would advise you to compromise multiple ATMs, because the jail time, the risk associated with compromising a single ATM isn't possibly worth it. So I'm going to talk about how you can capitalize on owning an ATM. So the first interesting thing that happened to me once I had an ATM in a car park is everyone who lived in the vicinity started asking questions about when the ATM would be available for use, which I thought, as a security researcher, was quite interesting. As I mentioned, I was able to obtain an ATM to take it to a conference. I then had to store it afterwards, which ended up being moved to my own apartment, because I had a concrete floor, which the ATM destroyed. But again, my neighbours started asking questions about when this ATM would be in use. So something dawned on me, which is you could put an ATM into the wild with a camera and you could start capturing people's card information and their PIN codes and see how many people actually did this. I mean, just as a survey to see how many people would do this. I'm not saying you should do it for the wrong reasons. So certainly that's one way to make money, or alternatively you could publish a research article on that. But it's really interesting how many people immediately said, when can I start using this thing? I was able to take it to a conference, so I took it to InfoSec 2017, fully intact. But it was an absolute logistical nightmare. So as I mentioned, this weighed 700 kilos, and unfortunately, you can't move something that weighs 700 kilos unless you have almost a crane, as it turns out, or someone who's willing to move this that has equipment for something that weighs 500 kilos. So I unfortunately ended up having to sort of bend the truth in order to get a courier to deliver this ATM from a car park to the venue. So I found someone who had a power-assisted lift, and it was the only one in the whole of the southeast of England. And he brought this ATM to the security conference at 9 o'clock at night the night before. So a complete nightmare. And then I had to deal with the storage afterwards. So as you can see, like I mentioned, the logistics is really the hardest part of owning an ATM. This is the ATM outside of my apartment. And this is some photography equipment that I've constructed a temporary shelter around the ATM in order to work on it and protect it from the weather. It was temporary. And again, the realization that no floor is suitable for an ATM. So I was able to deconstruct some aspects of my apartment door in order to get the ATM inside of my apartment. But it completely destroyed my floor, even though it was concrete. But the benefit of this is the BBC took a particular interest into the fact that I now had an ATM in my apartment. So I was able to get some coverage of this ATM, which was great for me and for the company I work for. But it was completely invasive because this whole thing was taking place in my apartment. And you can see on the left-hand side, that's Elliot, one of my cats, being stroked by one of the presenters. He has no idea what's going on. So here's a quick clip of the BBC piece, which you may have seen or may not have. And in it, they talk briefly about how you can hack an ATM in a consumer way. So it's very high level. So an attacker has come to the front of the ATM. They've drilled a hole in the front. You can see we can access this USB cable.
Right, so inside here, there's something that has a USB port. What's inside here?
This is just a normal computer.
I'm sure not many people would expect this to just be a normal Windows XP machine.
Perhaps not, but it's just a safe with a computer on top. Actual real money. So you could put malware on this system that could collect data from cards as well. So that would be information that's held on our cards. So if I, as a consumer, if I'm using this machine, it could collect my card data, and that could spread around the whole network of ATMs.
So you can use one ATM to infect a whole network of ATMs?
That's correct, yeah. And you can see my apartment in the background there. So this brings me on to the final chapter, which has a little bit to do with logistics as well. So if it wasn't evident from the brief for this talk, this ATM was completely deconstructed to its core, including the vault. So I'll just take you through that. So a lot of the security in protecting the money goes into the vault, and a vault consists of two steel chassis with steel-enforced concrete. as you can see there. So this was all taking place outside of my apartment, but it's interesting nonetheless to go about this process and to understand exactly where the security mechanisms in an ATM are. So a lot of the weight as a result is obviously in the bottom half of the ATM. And I'll just show you how you go about deconstructing an ATM. Looks rather like a Rammstein video. But you basically need a bunch of power tools in order to drill off the concrete, and then because you have steel fibers inside of that, it's very dangerous. And that concludes my talk. So just as a summary, what's really interesting about this is that anyone can do it. It doesn't really require a huge amount of skill. You just need a small amount of knowledge to do this. And it's an absolute logistical nightmare, so I wouldn't advise anyone go about buying an ATM themselves. But it's much easier to obtain legally than illegally, as it turns out. So if you have any questions, let me know. I've also included my email address and my Twitter handle there as well. Do we have a couple of minutes for questions? Okay.
So any questions, anybody, please?
Maybe they just want to go to lunch.
Maybe they all want to go to the nearest ATM.
Did you find any specific vendor-specific vulnerability in this ATM, or everything you said is not specific to the vendor?
It's not specific to the vendor per se. What's really interesting, though, that you raise a point that I didn't discuss because I was trying to condense this presentation, is that typically there's an issue with where the responsibility of security lies, and the vendors will say to the banks that it's your responsibility to buy a new unit, and that will solve your security issues. But of course you can configure an old ATM to be secure.
Hi, did you inspect potential attack vectors that didn't require the modification of the ATM at all? So keeping it in its original state and still hack it?
Yeah, so it's possible. So for example, if you access the service area, so you can lockpick the service area, you don't have to physically modify like the front of the facade, no damage has to occur. So yeah, that's something I looked at as well, is you can then just send commands to the dispenser directly. That's another option.
Did you get any attention from the police when you're conducting your research?
That's a very good question. So another piece that I missed out is following this, following the broadcast from the BBC, I was walking down the street and there was an ATM which had been vandalized, shall we say, and some of the cables had been pulled out. So I realized that when you publish research of any kind, you then become like the front or the receptor for any bad news as well. So people say, oh, well, you've shown people how to do that. But of course, that's not the case, because a 5-minute video or a video saying, oh, this is a computer with a vault on top, obviously doesn't go into the details of how you would execute an attack from start to end. And it also doesn't take into consideration that there's a big difference between people who work in security and criminals, and that's their intention, right? Any other questions, or are you ready for lunch? One more question?
Yeah, so I would like to ask, what's the operating system distribution? Is Windows XP still the most commonly used?
Yeah, pretty much. So it's Windows XP, and a lot of the newer ATMs are Windows 7, but predominantly it's Windows XP. Well, thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoy lunch.